go with it.
I'm really pleased this morning to welcome Dr. Vilma Balmaceda, who is the Associate Director of the Duke Divinity's Center for Reconciliation. She leads Peace and Hope International, a faith-based nonprofit dedicated to building peace and confronting violence and other forms of injustice among marginalized communities through its sister Paz y Esperanza organizations in Latin America. I turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. And is it okay to remain unmuted, or do you want
No,
to
you,
yourself?
you can be heard.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I am delighted to be here at the Montague Barker Lecture Series here at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. I want to share my gratitude, express how much I appreciate this opportunity to you, Tom, and Paul Samuel for your invitation, to Martin and Sue Alavai for their warm hospitality. And I am so happy to have one of my colleagues here from Peace and Hope in the UK, Gordon Davis. Thank you for being here. I also bring warm greetings from my colleagues at the Duke Center for Reconciliation at Duke University, my colleagues serving with Peace and Hope in Latin America, and also the leaders of more than 25 organizations, congregations, and academic institutions in the Americas who have joined the Americas Initiative on Transformation and Reconciliation. If you want to learn more about the AITR, please visit us at AITR.org. The website is available in Spanish, Portuguese, our two main languages in Americas, and English. While I have learned so much with the people I just mentioned, I want to acknowledge that my reflections are my sole responsibility. The key argument for this talk is that we need to be alert today more than ever, particularly in the Americas, although there may be some factors that make this relevant in other contexts. But my context of analysis is the Americas, including the United States, but particularly Latin America. And I believe that in that region, we need to be ever alert about the threat of manipulation of religious discourse for partisan purposes that are against God's kingship. This is a descriptive, but also a normative conceptualization based on empirical observation across the Americas, and an exhortation to reconsider the need for a more integral Christian discipleship formation in the church. I have 5 main points. We'll start with a brief introduction and the historical background, a description of the challenges in this area. Basically, the current political context in the America creates certain factors that make it more tempting for political actors to manipulate their congregations. I have a hypothesis about Christians being part of the general persuadable middle in society. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what it means in terms of understanding the risk or threat of persuasion or manipulation of the church. And then what is more relevant, I think, for this audience is hopefully we can have a conversation about the opportunities that this situation brings to Christians, especially those of us in the area of responsibility for Christian discipleship and formation and missiological considerations. So as I just said, I'm hoping to contribute to a better understanding of societal and political forces that interact with local churches in the Americas and beyond. The local church as a social and cultural institution, not only as a spiritual institution, is never apolitical. Even when some leaders of local congregations may think that politics is not important, people of faith are citizens when individually considered, and their collectives, the congregations, are part of civil society. God's kinship needs to understand this with humility and not desire for power. The mission of announcing the good news and caring for God's kingship is quite different, even opposed to the pursuit of power in human terms. Faith communities of all the different denominations are part of civil society, for better or worse. The context in which communities of faith exist affects the life of any congregation. In the same vein, churches are living collectives. They are expected to play a role in the wider community. And Christians do play a political role, even when they are silent. The problem is when the churches play a partisan role. So I am distinguishing between being aware of our political life and responsibilities from being partisan. In this presentation, politics refers to the activities involved in getting and using power in public life and being able to influence decisions that affect a country or a society. From the Oxford Conversation, I thought that would be the best source. Whether local congregations or church denominations raise their voices in support for or in opposition to social realities and or public policies, for example, workers' exploitation, which is a daily experience in the Americas, racism, poverty, violence, migration, issues related to gender and sexuality, etc. Or they support the status quo by choosing to remain silent, because that's what it means. Remaining silent is not being neutral, it's supporting the status quo. When Christians choose to do that, or they have explicit support for particular policies, they are playing a political role as part of their country's civil society. Again, political, not necessarily partisan. Recognizing this fact of social life, however, is not the same as saying that churches should be partisan entities. In fact, this paper's argument is that given the current socio-political context in most countries of the Americas, local congregations and church denominations must remain ever alert and vigilant to partisan manipulation. Therefore, we must strive to understand the complex historical and immediate causes of the problems affecting the population, especially vulnerable groups. To do this, we must consider the teachings of the gospel and the findings of social science regarding the impacts of public policies in order to contribute to and support the effective implementation of public policies that promote equity and access to opportunities. So what to consider when choosing to support or opposing a public policy? I believe that Christians must oppose policies that foster the concentration of people and deepen inequality. For many reasons, let me just mention. Policies that foster further economic wealth concentration, deepen inequality, contribute to increasing the likelihood of abuse of power and corruption, particularly but not only in the global south. These are difficult and complex issues which should invite us to question the superficial answers that we often hear from the lips of political candidates and sadly sometimes also from church leaders. Facing these questions, especially in contexts of political polarization and widespread discontent with democracy, due to the lack of effectiveness of the institutions of political representation, makes this challenge even more difficult. The global COVID-19 pandemic exposed and in some cases exacerbated many social and economic problems in most countries. This is true particularly in the Americas. This content is present in several industrialized democracies, even more so in countries that are affected by multiple crises. Yet, because it is a tough challenge, it does not mean we should not care to find ways to address it. our responsibility is to seek just peace. As a one word, not only peace, but a peace that has a foundation in justice. As believers, we are responsible for seeking not the numerical growth of a particular congregation or denomination, but for bearing witness and embodying God's love for all of creation, embodying the message of just peace and reconciliation of Jesus of Nazareth. I submit to you that the combined term just peace is the best translation of shalom, the biblical term that refers to peace and justice as inherently connected. The religious landscape in the Americas has been changing considerably since the 1960s, as increasing numbers of Latin Americans identify as Protestant or evangelical Christians. Different from other regions in the world, in Latin America especially, the term Protestant or evangelical are used interchangeably. So that's how I'm using it. Then I would not say they are interchangeable in the United States, by the way, but in Latin America, yes, they are. In most of Latin America. The nature of the religious experience should not be attained. The religious experience is not something that only affects a person's spirit. It involves a set of questions and ideas about who God is, about the self, about who my neighbor is, about the community that we call our own, about our surroundings in all of creation. Since the beginning of the Cold War, if not before, many evangelical leaders in the Americas have been consuming literature that are direct translations from white evangelical writers in the United States. This has had an impact in the way of thinking of many evangelical leaders and increases the potential for an ideological use of faith. But we know that context is extremely important. The Cold War, circa 1947 to 1991, was a period of geopolitical tension and competition for global dominance between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. Even when there was no declared war between the two superpowers, nor actual fighting in their respective territories, the US and the USSR measured their forces through proxy wars in other countries. In the Americas, this included El Salvador and Nicaragua. In the case of Latin America also, the United States' influence most times was reflected in the direct or indirect support of military or civic military dictatorships that brutally repressed movements seeking more social justice and democratic governance. This was particularly evident in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Paraguay, Uruguay, among others. The end of the Cold War, early 1990s, allowed for democratic transitions in many countries of the Americas. Only Colombia, Costa Rica, and Venezuela had remained democratic during that period in Latin America. The third wave of democratization that started in the late 1970s brought the return of competitive party politics to most countries in the Americas. The 1980s and 1990s saw the hope for democratic transformation rise, only to see the hopes of many people shattered by the drastic imposition of neoliberal economic policies in the region. In Peru, in particular, my home country, the return of democracy also saw the rise of the shining path and the elision of political violence in the country. This was a period, the worst period of violence in the history of the country since independence. In the 2020s, Latino Barometer continues to report decreasing levels of support for democracy in the region. In 17 countries in the Americas, less than half of responders responded that they supported democracy in their country, according to the Latino Barometer report of 2021. Now, in this context, we wonder, what are the political forces that tend to be favored by evangelical Christians? After the end of the Cold War in Latin America, high numbers of evangelicals had supported violent politicians, and even some declared and explicitly anti-democratic leaders, such as Efraín Ríos Montt in Guatemala, who was the de facto president, imposing himself by force in 1992 and 1983 during the Guatemalan War. Later was the head of Congress in the 1995 through 96, in 2003, and 2004. Alberto Fujimori in Peru, 1990 through 2000. Álvaro Uribe in Colombia, 2002 to 2010. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, since 2007 present. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, 2019, sorry, not to present, thankfully. There was a change in government earlier this year. Now, this is not an exclusive Latin American phenomenon that evangelical Christians tend to support violent groups. For example, Andrew Decourt recently reported in Abiy's Ethiopia, Christian imperialism is resurgent. In this article, he makes the argument of how the national leader uses evangelical favor to launch war against a minority group. And we could also refer to the role that the Orthodox Church has played in Soviet times and currently under Putin in Russia. The challenges. It's a current political context of party decay. 50 years after the end of the Cold War, political parties in the Americas are experiencing the process of de-institutionalization and in some countries, almost complete decay. Particularly worrisome is the situation in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Honduras. As Morgan and Melendez have noticed, the process of party deinstitutionalization is present even in Chile, which is extremely concerning given that Chile is one of the few Latin American countries where the party system had reached institutionalization for decades. Political representation is an essential component of modern democratic politics. Representation means to have a voice or influence in political decisions. When political representation is effective, citizens are likely to accept the results reached through the democratic processes, even when their preferred party loses an election. In contemporary democratic systems, while civic organizations and social movements play a role in representation, the function of articulating broad interests and implementing public policies corresponds to political parties. Therefore, in democratic systems, political parties are the most important agents for the representation. Parties are expected to be the bridges between society and government institutions, giving systematic voice to the concerns of citizens as agents operating within the state concerns. In Latin America, political representation through parties tends to be very low in quality, weakening the trust in democratic institutions. Now, I have to say a word in terms of defending political parties and careers. Political parties are not necessarily evil institutions, even though we have to recognize that they are prone to corruption. When they operate within minimum standards of decency, honesty, and transparency, as political parties for those political parties that have a real commitment to honesty and decency in the use of resources, they can contribute to the well-being of the nation. In fact, there is no democracy, real democracy possible without political parties. In the same vein, pursuing a political career can be a dignified career choice when individuals do it with honesty, integrity, and the necessary academic and practical preparation. And here is a problem, because we have Christian leaders in the Americas that gain popularity and influence in the context of the church, but they lack the necessary academic and or practical preparation for political career. We are not investing time, energy, and resources in discipling people for political leadership. And this is a serious problem. And many Latin American countries today are seeing the very negative consequences of it. Having qualified party candidates who can clarify and justify policy positions to the electorate contributes to increasing the quality of political representation and therefore to the good functioning of modern democracy. So let's take a moment to talk about linkage. I will present a definition and a few strategies in modern democracies. Schultz and Wilkinson, as well as Morgan and Melendez, among others, have argued that the best way to assess the process of political representation empirically is by assessing the varied linkage strategies that political parties implement. This means that the ways in which political parties and citizens exchange support and influence is important when analyzing the quality of political representation. I will talk about three specific linkage strategies, which are programmatic linkage, clientelism, and incorporation. Programmatic linkage is a strategy based on policy responsiveness or shared ideological positions regarding widespread concerns in the country. For example, if we are concerned with inflation and we trust a political party, we vote for that party to focus on decreasing inflation or decreasing unemployment. Hopefully not at the expense of everything else, but also paying attention to the need for public education or improving health services, adapting and reducing environmental decay, lack of public safety, etc., etc., etc. All of these problems are immediate, very real contemporary problems in most of the Americas and probably most of the world. So different political parties will offer different policy solutions based on their ideological orientation. This type of linkage provides indirect and conditional benefits. In other words, if a party wins the election and is successful in pursuing a policy that will decrease inflation, people who voted for them and people who did not vote for them will benefit, right? So that's the nature of programmatic linkage. It benefits everybody when the policies that the government is implementing are effective. The second strategy for linkage is clientelism, very well known in Latin America and most of the global South, probably also in the global North. Clientelism offers direct, excludable benefits to individuals or relatively small groups of voters in exchange for their support. Examples: offering free gasoline in exchange for placing the party banner in your vehicle, distributing shoes, food, mattresses, whatever, in exchange for promises of support on the day of the election. Patronage, in particular, it's a particular kind of clientelism that tends to be the intra-party flow of benefits to party members. So here's an example from my home country in Peru. A political party hires a medical doctor, an eye doctor, and arranges for the team to come from little town to village to the other village for people who probably never in their lives before had the chance to have their eyes checked. So if you think about this, I've had these long discussions with colleagues in Argentina and Brazil. Some people would make the argument, hey, clientelism is not that bad. For once in their lifetime, they will have a doctor see them, right? Without clientelism, they might never see somebody check their teeth or their eyes. The third linkage strategy is incorporation. Incorporation involves the integration of major political salient societal interests through group-targeted policies and benefits, reserving party nominations for representatives of such groups and/or identity-based appeals to specific sectors of the population. And I want to share with you an example. This is a person that I know, Pastor Julio Rosas, who was in Congress from 2011 to 2019. He and the members of the Evangelical Caucus of the Peruvian Congress in the past decade, very close allies of the Fujimori Party, of the time. Meaningful programmatic competition happens, going back to the first category of linkage. Meaningful programmatic competition happens when political parties embrace clearly differentiated policy positions. They explain them to the people, and people who understand what they're explaining to them decide, I am going to vote for this party or the other party, this other alternative approach. Sadly, it is becoming more common that parties are unable to offer meaningful programmatic alternatives to deal with relevant issues, because many of their members will apply the other two strategies. So forget about programmatic competition. Let's go with clientelism and incorporation. In context with exacerbated social, economic, and political crises, like those currently affecting many countries in the region, effective programmatic linkage, therefore, is harder to achieve. Situations of crisis frequently call for responses that go beyond ordinary policy adjustments and require innovative or complicated solutions that ideologies are not able to offer. It's not surprising, therefore, that clientelism continues to be the main linkage mechanism in many Latin American countries. But this strategy has its limits. There are not enough resources to distribute individualized benefits among party supporters. So in a context where parties are desperate for finding ways to gain support among the population, religion, a key dimension of human identity, is a low-hanging fruit to be exploited by both sincere and disingenuous Christian politicians and other political agents that are not necessarily Christian. The current democratic fragility and the low-hanging fruit represented by religious fervor and limited critical thinking skills make faith communities in many places unattractive. So in context of party linkage decay, politicians seek alternative ways of establishing linkages with the growing number of evangelical congregations and parachurch organizations in their respective countries. To achieve this goal, they use a combination of linkage strategies. They pursue religious leaders promising policies that are easy to enact. For example, prohibiting legal access to abortion services, or denying employment, legal protections for LGBTQ+ people, etc. Instead of the much harder endeavor of preventing sexual violence against women, or guaranteeing equal pay, or protecting gay people from not being fired from their jobs just on the basis of their sexual identity. In other words, it's so easy to promise that they will just pass a law that will do something by negative action, rather than engaging in ways that would truly achieve the purpose, for example, of decreasing substantially the occurrence of abortion in the country. Connect with the evangelical predominant vote. Political actors use group-targeted messages. For example, they promise certain benefits to groups connected to them. They offer party nominations for representatives of such groups, and especially they articulate identity-based appeals to this specific sector, the national population. This articulation, however, is rather superficial, as it is discussed in the next section. I want to say just a word about this. It's not that I consider the people shown here my enemies, and that's why I'm picturing them so much. It's just that the example is just so, the evidence is just so evident. This is the evangelical caucus really charging against homosexual people in Peru. Sadly, at the same time, and I say this with utter respect, I know this is one, not the only, but one of the most delicate issues that divides Christians. So I am saying this with respect to anyone who may have different positions. This is not about the specific position, it's how it's used to attract the support of evangelicals. So while this group was literally throwing stones at a percentage of the population that probably is not as small as one may think. At the same time, they were allied with the most corrupt political party in the country, and that happens to be the most violent political party in the country. The leader is in prison because of gross human rights violations against innocent people. So let me submit to you this hypothesis that I personally found, and I hope you will see that it is plausible, possible, is that like the rest of society, evangelical Christians only follow a regular distribution in terms of political preferences. What does this mean? Like the population in general, we may think that people of faith have different political preferences and that most of them are not necessarily in the political extremes. This means that at best, people on each side of the distribution of ideological distribution have clear, profound convictions, but at worst, it's the people in the farther extremes who are blinded by ideology. But most people can actually be persuaded one way or the other, depending on what's going on in the country and who the candidates are in the platform of political parties. And being persuadable is not a bad thing. But there is a serious problem if citizens who are Christian believers sacrifice the common good in exchange for one or two issues in the public agenda. One way in which politicians and their operatives seek to connect with people of faith is through persuasion. Persuasion is a major part of politics, lobbying, speech-making, debating, writing letters, issuing position papers, and making proclamations in the form of court decisions, executive orders, laws, and policies. They are all examples of political persuasion. As long as the political operatives are trying to persuade people of faith, making their intentions clear, persuasion is a legitimate behavior in the marketplace of ideas and political positions. In fact, you may say, Nina is trying to persuade me of something today. And yes, I am, and I am telling you that I am doing that. Manipulation is quite different. Manipulation happens when the political parties, individual candidates, or other political agents conceal their aims and intentions. Why is political manipulation so dangerous? Well, when people are persuaded, they are able to recognize that they have been convinced by the arguments presented to them, or that they are rejecting the arguments, right? They were not convinced. By contrast, when people are manipulated, they do not recognize it. They don't realize that somebody is trying to impose a way of thinking about something. And the implication is deeply disturbing. As Grigsby has noted, how can you resist something if you do not know it is happening to you? So even though manipulation is very difficult to prove, precisely because of its hidden nature, empirical evidence shows that politicians and some religious leaders in the Americas try to manipulate believers by using superficial connections to the people's faith in a few passages from Holy Scripture. Political operatives do not tell their evangelical audiences, hello, I am here, I have hired someone who has taught me some key phrases that Christians like to hear, and I will make you vote for me or my candidate or my party. They would never come to your church or to your neighborhood meeting and tell you that. Talking about superficiality of Christian commitment, you know, the use of symbols that make people, again, at a very superficial level think, oh, we agree on something important. No, what they say, whether it's from the pulpit or a YouTube video, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Christian radio or television station, is more like this. I was praying this morning and God told me. I have had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ, and he has called me to be your next leader. God has anointed me, or God has anointed this man or woman to defend your Christian rights, your freedoms in society, because they are coming for us, so we need to defend ourselves. The church needs to impose God's power, at least I heard in Brazil. The church needs to impose God's power on society, and we will install a theocracy for God's glory. To the right, you will see, this is a photo that I took this morning. I went there because I wanted to make sure that the video still exists. This video is for Keiko Fujimori, a very well-known, always a candidate, never a winner, in Peru, daughter of a former dictator. And this video in particular is presented by an American pastor who prays for her and interviews her, asking what does God mean to her. And she shares her experience of conversion and why God really has declared and revealed that she will be the leader that will change Peru. So the listeners hear someone who talks like them, and they hear a discourse that sounds Christian to them. Things that they recognize as their own, such an experience of conversion, the practice of prayer, a revelation, etc. Ignoring that the candidates or other political agents are exploiting their faith. The existence of cloaked motives and the language layers they use implies some degree of manipulation. In some cases, like in this particular video, I would qualify it as severe. And you have the link there. It's in Spanish, unfortunately. So this way of doing politics has severe vulnerabilities for democracy as a whole and for the health of the church, social and cultural institution, and especially for the spiritual health of God's kingdom. So what can be done? In a context where we know that politicians find it very hard to implement solid programmatic linkage. Therefore, they rely more on clientelism and incorporation practices. This further diminishes the prospects for programmatic representation and increases the temptation that they will use identity issues to connect with potential voters. Well, naturally, the first conclusion or the first implication for missiology would be that Christian teaching, as the way the predominant Christian teaching currently is painfully incomplete. Cases often wrong. Christian teaching should prepare citizens to reject single issue and oversimplified political messaging, because the competition for votes without relevant programmatic linkage with the population creates powerful incentives to use rhetoric that exploits faith. Excuse me, so we need deeper critical thinking in civic formation. How do we, as pastors, teachers, missionaries, contribute to make our life as a disciple, more holistic? What we would say in Latin America. In Latin America, how is mission integral, affecting all aspects of life, not just what happens on Sunday morning? When I am tempted by changing the numbers of seats on Wednesday, how do I resist that? Christian citizens need to be prepared to avoid single-issue politics and consider the coherence needed in political discourse and action. That words are not enough. Coherence between political discourse and action as they consider what parties and candidates they will support. The increase in the assassination of environmental activists, human rights defenders, indigenous leaders, and journalists, among others, and the continued weakening of the democratic system need to be concerns for churches too. How can we explain that whole congregations are at war with the particular sectors of society based on one issue and not acknowledging the many layers how violence is affecting their country, society? If you talk to average evangelicals in many countries of Latin America, they wouldn't even know that environmental activists are being killed on a weekly basis. They wouldn't know what an environmental activist. What do they do? How are they connected to the good purposes of God for this world? Fortunately, I am talking about the pattern. There's always exceptions. I can tell you about the exceptions, but sadly, the pattern is what I am focusing on. I believe that we also need, and I am wrapping up finally, we also need to reconsider our spiritual commitments. I do believe that the kind of spirituality, a vibrant spirituality that supports this kind of political discipleship, civic discipleship, has spirituality on the one side of the coin and the other one is Christian ethics for sure, and they are inseparable, they are indivisible. So this kind of vibrant spiritual life that we need to cultivate, teach, and learn with others, first of all, is profoundly personal, but not individualistic. And this is one clear problem of the predominance, historical predominance of the American evangelical missionary movement in Latin America. That the gospel that was brought emphasizes personal conversion as an individualistic conversion. Second, as I said earlier, has to be a spirituality of shalom, of just peace. Not only that I know God and I have the peace that surpasses all understanding. That's one of our favorite New Testament verses. It doesn't matter what happens around me. I have the peace of Christ in my heart. I was told that so many times while the country was falling apart because of the war. And we had no answer. We had, as Christians, we had no platform, no proposal about what to do in the civil war. So we really need to think again that as spiritual beings pursuing integral mission, we need to have an articulation and a deep understanding of the demands of a theology of creation, as I am learning it's called here. At the Center for Reconciliation, we like to call it a theology of justice, of peace based on the foundation of justice for all. Also, a vibrant spirituality that worships God through all of life. And of course, we are different people. Some people meet God in their beautiful cathedrals. I mean, I'm delighted to be here. I'm enjoying myself so much be here at Oxford University, but for others, it happens when seeing the power of waves. And many people in my own country will go up to the highland. You can hardly breathe and find God up there, like the Hebrew people, right? God lives on the top of the mountain. So different people will have spiritual experiences that speak to them very personally. But in all of that is beautiful, and going to a building that has been consecrated to worship God, of course, also is very beautiful and important and enriching. And yet, the experience of worshiping God through in every aspect of life, including when we go and we have to vote, not for the best candidate that we like, but many times for the least worst, the least evil, the minimally decent candidate as an act of worship. And of course, this spirituality that we need to learn more about and cultivate is profoundly incarnation. It's following the example of our Lord. And being Lord of Lords became human, and being human became slave. Being a slave willingly for his life, for his blood to save all of humanity. In light of that spirit example, as Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, we live and we are moved to practice lament, not triumphalism. Lament is so opposed to the spirit that characterizes so many congregations. But when we truly pay attention to what is happening, all the violence happening every day against women, children, indigenous communities, the pain and suffering that we as a whole, and certain groups in particular, are inflicting against God's creation, we need to practice lament and seek discernment about what we can do in lament to move in action with love, compassion, and seeking justice. This spirituality also invites us to be more than ever willing to listen to others and enables us to learn from others. To value all of God's creation and see how much our sister nature can teach us about our common creator. To help us live with ambiguity and not knowing everything. So what I mean by this is that, yes, it is true, human politics, so my field is political science. And many times when we pursue with specific policies backfire, we are not able to reach the goal that we want. Let me give you just one example. We would want, of course, every employee to have not just a decent salary, but a really good salary. But in certain contexts, ensuring that people have decent, good salaries means that many people will never be. So we really need to go beyond the surface of a public policy and consider the context and be willing to live with ambiguity, knowing that, politically speaking, we will never be fully satisfied. So it is important for us to know, so since we will not be satisfied and we will never have everything the way we think God wants, or until God comes back and show us perfect society, perfect family, perfect government, we really need to have our priorities clear. And priorities is that human beings with creation can have their minimum needs covered. That children don't go hungry at night, that women don't suffer rape or violence, that healthcare and education be available even when people are in poverty. So we really need to reconsider our priorities as individual citizens in past communications. Okay, finally, we need to have a gender perspective when considering how we pursue public policy and who we support. For government, I see this as a very frustrated Peruvian citizen. I always wanted to have a woman president, but not any woman president. Let me say just that. We can leave it for Q&A. I can explain why I'm saying what I'm saying. And finally, this vibrant spirituality for civic formation needs to rest and find recreation in nature. You may think, in light of what I just explained, that we need to be working 8 days a week, and that is a recipe for disaster. We really need to take seriously, not just as a repentant workaholic. It is very important to care for our bodies as we care for our church and for beautiful buildings that are consecrated to honor God. The most important building is the body of human beings in the rest of creation. In conclusion, the church does not need to capture political power to bear witness of the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. But Christians need to be responsible citizens and recognize that they are accountable to God and to their fellow citizens in how they live, how they consume, and how they use their vote and political rights. Muchas gracias.
Excellent presentation. If you want to ask Nina a question or make a comment and you're online, at the bottom, there's a button called reactions. And if you push that, it'll say raise hand. I will note that and call on you to ask Nina a question. I guess I'll always start with a comment or question. Well, first, thank you. I really found that even yeah, a little, I wish I need to go back over it several times to get it all in. There's so much there, it's so rich. A lot of it kind of hinges on the whole idea of civil society. So church is a civil society, not necessarily in that a partisan organization. I guess one comment would be is then that has to take into the whole mix of how AI works. Because one of the things that's going on, as we all know, it was funny because I was in a really interesting talk with a friend of mine. We differ politically. She's very liberal San Franciscan who was over visiting. But as we were talking about that, and she's a brilliant lawyer woman thinking, we both recognize that both on the left and the right, triggers are being used to make us partisans. So even something like the New York Times, so I think a lot of people, and it's the one newspaper I actually subscribe to. It's because you get a really good article. But it's now starting to put up trigger articles. And we both noted that there are words, one of the trigger words is Trump.
Algorithms with Facebook that will let you see only what you want to see.
That's right. And it puts you down a rabbit hole in that regard. And on the other side, these things that kind of line you up. What are some things that maybe we can do in church and in civil society to start educating for the very thing you're advocating, which is so important, that we're able to look at the different sides of an issue and go, how are we listening and responding and not becoming simply a partisan for one side or the other, but to really be a thoughtful person who's engaged.
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. Yes, first of all, is to learn to dialogue. To dialogue means that I am not crossing you off because I just discovered that you are too liberal for me or too conservative for me. But to actually being able to go above these ideological barriers and being willing to listen, and to listen not like I am listening noises around, but to actually listen for understanding, which is not the same as listening for agreement, right? So to give the other person a chance. And I just love the Freirean approach to education, not assuming that I have the whole truth and I am dumping it to the congregation or my students or whoever the group is, but actually coming as an equal, giving opportunity for groups to dialogue and explore things and go deeper as opposed to just staying with the surface declaration. We are for X and Y. It's like, what does that mean? How will that impact the most vulnerable groups in society? I personally believe that's number one responsibility of Christians. How public policies impact the lives of those who are most vulnerable.
Good, thank you, Nina. Israel, go ahead and then we'll do first Israel and then Mark and then go ahead, Israel.
Okay. Thank you, Nina. It was a wonderful exposition of a very important and current topic to our country, to our continent. This kind of meeting between political power and church powers, and how to do the right in between it, how to follow a worldview that is shaped by deep Christian values about the other. I was thinking, how much do you think our Latin American culture has been an ally of the manipulation of the people in power? I'm thinking about this hierarchical way to understand our relationships, the categories that are so clear in our Latin American societies. In Peru, the easiness for seeing discrimination because of race, for example, lack of education, and so on. And in the churches, nonetheless, those who might have a place of power, there is a kind of equivalent to be God's sent person. So you cannot discuss their positions, you cannot discuss their views. How do you think we could work in order to get a way to contribute to a solution, to come to really a more research-based understanding on this issue of manipulation in our Christian evangelical world in Latin America?
Thank you, Israel. Yeah, you point one factor that it's very important, and it has to do with the way, especially, I mean, I don't think there is a Latin American culture. There are many Latin American cultures, but there is this constant across in its male chauvinism in particular, right? The hierarchy also follows racial lines or skin tone lines, but especially male chauvinism is so omnipresent still. So one way, I think, is to go back to the Bible, because when we are actually willing to read the Bible with eyes that want to see and ears that want to hear, we may discover how the good news of the gospel come and confront completely that particular way of being that is so hierarchical and that gives voice to only less than half of the population. And actually inviting people to come together and study the Bible together and seeing, for example, how our Lord Jesus of Nazareth went to Bethania to visit his friends, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. And Martha ran to the kitchen because the young rabbi had come, and all of his friends had come, and probably, as it was the custom at the time, the neighbors had come to the house also. So Martha was really busy trying to be a good hostess. And Mary was just sitting among the men, listening to the rabbi. It's so interesting to me always when approaching scripture to make sure I am wearing the right glasses, because I'm very blind. I need the right glasses, but I also need the right glasses of a gender perspective, because Jesus is listening that Martha from the kitchen keeps calling, right? So interesting, Martha is not calling Lazarus. Martha is not calling the neighbors, the men, to come and help. He's complaining that her sister is not helping. And Jesus is teaching Martha that maybe at that moment, she would be welcome to learn with the men. So I think it's just a matter of how we come to the scriptures and read it one more time and discover a Jesus of Nazareth that is incredibly egalitarian, that gives food and miracles to foreigners, that talks to women of very bad reputation, and who declares that the prostitutes and even those that charge us too much on our taxes might walk to heaven before the religious people. So Israel, I think we need to bring together our pastors, bring together our Christian leaders, and invite them to reconsider issues of hierarchy and issues of whose voices we want to pay attention.
Mark.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you also to Marina for chasing me earlier, because I had a partner work on my desk and I wasn't going to come, but I'm very glad I did come. So thank you for that. An observation and then a question. My observation takes us right back to the very beginning, where you pulled the definition of politics
Yeah.
out of the Oxford
Learner's
Learner's Dictionary, which I don't want to argue with, it comes from a good place in Oxford. But I was surprised that the key word in that definition was power, when I think historically, in terms of politics, or political engagement, I think much more in terms of representation, service, and stewardship of the community resources, rather than power.
Yes.
Although,
That's
of course, contemporaneously, we see power being exercised. It is the key word in a lot of the exercising of politics. So I think there may be an issue there to do with how we define politics and what people's expectations are as they go into politics. But that's my observation. My question is a bit further on. I was very pleased to hear you talking about discipleship and how discipleship is about the whole of life. I spent the last 6 years working with the Anglican Church internationally on whole life discipleship and just helping people to see that discipleship is more than about Bible study and prayer and what you do on Sunday. We actually had a very good consultation in Peru with the Anglican bishops there.
I hope you had good.
Yeah, we had brilliant food, yes. But one of the issues which came up actually in Peru, but also in other places around the world who did that, is how can a church teach whole life discipleship and the use of Christian values in politics, in the working environment, in leisure activities, etc. When those that do most of the teaching in the churches don't have the daily experience of those contexts, because they don't go to a different place and work on a Monday. They don't have to struggle with their housing very often because their housing is provided by the church. They don't have many other experiences that so-called normal people have. They don't have, and so their understanding of whole life discipleship is actually a bit restricted. So how can they teach it to others? I don't know if you haven't thought about it.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate your first comment as well. I think I chose this particular. Let me show it if I may. Just go back to, or I'll just read it to you one more time. Politics refers to the activities involved in getting and using power in public life and being able to influence decisions that affect a country or a society. And the reason, but I love what you are contributing, and I definitely include it. But the reason why I chose this one actually was not because it came from Oxford. That was a joke. It does come from Oxford Learner's Dictionary. But my interest was highlighting this, that currently, especially in countries where evangelicals right now are close to being 50% of the population, and in some countries even way past 50%, right? Sadly, those tend to be the most violent countries and with the worst policies, like the most disprotections to women. Think of El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua. Nicaragua is not as high the percentage, but the policies are really poor. Now, talking about the leftist leaders also manipulating Christians. That's Ortega, and I mentioned that in the paper. But the idea, sadly, in many countries where, you know, if Christians voted as a whole bloc, they could get their evangelical president.
Yeah.
And they're thinking of terms of capturing government as the goal. That is going to be like, I am super afraid of that. Of a candidate of that type getting to the presidency. Right. So that's the reasoning behind, but I really appreciate your contribution about talking about who decides about the distribution of resources, which is extremely important. And about churches and the pastors and their life experience. The diversity of congregations in Latin America is amazing. You see, if you go to the little villages at the top of the mountains in the Andes of Peru and Bolivia, or in Colombia, the red zones where still armed groups control life, or the favelas of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where, you know, it's a nightmare to live. The government many times is not present. The police, when the police shows up, basically it's just to massacre people. It's not a presence that people feel like, oh, the police are here, we're going to be protected, right? The government, the state, the presence of the state, the public authority is absent or very negative. Cases like that. Church is present. In Colombia, just visited Colombia last March and doing research there. And I found that people do not yet have access to psychotherapy. They go to their pastor to cry together. The pastors themselves, men and women, mostly men, are survivors of violence themselves.
Yeah.
So these are traumatized people who have received a call from the Lord to serve. They are as poor as the people they are trying to help. And I must be completely honest. It's not that I agree with them theologically on many issues, but I admire their commitment to be the shoulder where people will come to tell that their child has been killed by the FARC or by the government or the paramilitary, that they lost their wife or husband to an intervention by the police or whatever. So actually, there are so many pastors who never have visited a seminary, but also who are not hired by the church because these churches are shacks. They are just willing to take the Bible, they are armed with their Bible. And again, yes, sometimes what they read in the Bible is not what I would wish they read in the Bible, that they would understand what the Bible is trying to say. But they are there where so many public authority figures will never know. So from that perspective, I do believe that they do have a better understanding, and we really need to pay attention to what they are telling us about their context. If you go to the capital cities of many countries in the region, the story is quite different. They have well-established buildings where they worship the Lord. They have secured housing, and it may not be the highest salary or whatever, but they have a secured salary compared to regular members who are fighting every day, struggling every day to feed their families. So this is a real concern, but I'm afraid that a number probably represents the smaller number of churches compared to the great number of churches in the margins, where pastors are just struggling as hard as everyone else in the congregation to make it. But to Israel's point, what is true is that because of Latin American cultures tend to be hierarchical in some contexts more than others, more male chauvinistic, pastors will have this advantage, quote unquote, that their voice is heard. That's why I'm so interested in this paper and receiving feedback, because if we could get pastors to be alert to this issue of political manipulation, to get formation themselves, to understand more critically, to recognize discourses and discourses, hopefully the pulpit then becomes more of an instrument of liberation rather of manipulation.
I'm gonna go with Adise, for me, go ahead, Adise, Marina. So Adise, unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom and Dina. My question is general concerning the extreme silent and the extreme violent. That might not be directly related to the Latin American, but sometimes because of the past context, many Christians and churches prefer to be silent, not to get involved in politics, and then that really makes also a bad direction for a nation or for a Christian community. That is one question. My observation of your using Avi's Christian imperialism, quoting Andrew Ducart, might be much debated previously in different articles, but such really blanket generalization might also create problems in some contexts. So just your reflection on that. Thank you.
Let me make sure that I understood. The question is about concern for overgeneralizing what Christians think or what Christians do. Is that the question?
Yeah, the first question is preferring to be silent, not to get involved in politics. Like let me give you a context from Ethiopia, not from
Right.
Latin America. But during the socialist time, Christians prefer to be silent because they say that, okay, politics and electricity is like, if you touch it, it will destroy you. And then people prefer to get engaged.
Self-preservation.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Okay, let's address the first question then. I'm interested in the second question too, so don't let me forget. I had in the early 2000s, I had the opportunity of visiting Argentina, and I was interviewing survivors of torture during the period of the Dirty War, during the Cold War, under the military dictatorship. And among my several interviews, I had the privilege of talking to a professor of history, Professor Ancini, who is now with the Lord. And I basically asked him the same question our brother is asking. How do you explain so many churches remaining silent? Not all churches, but too many churches remaining silent during the Dirty War that took the lives of thousands of Argentinians, torture of tens of thousands of Argentinians, and for so many years kept the military government. And Professor Ancini started to say, well, we were very afraid. So he was very honest, right? He did not have like a justification for the silence, except to acknowledge they were afraid for themselves and for the people in their churches. Granted, and I respect that, but he then said, but we have to recognize that our theology was not broad enough to guide us about what we should. And since then, that has been my purpose, to contribute in dialogue, to see how we can expand our theological understanding. And yes, it is very hard when you are in the middle of the war. However, being silent is not being neutral. Remaining silent does not mean we are not involved. Remaining silent is giving power to the most powerful side. So while I don't have an answer for you, dear brother, but I appreciate your question because it invites us to say, what should be, for example, maybe this should not be on Ethiopian Christians, but in the rest of the world. Where is the solidarity of the rest of the world in supporting and caring, not only for the lives of Christians in Ethiopia, but for every single life in Ethiopia in the context of war? So much to do, much to articulate in terms of what should be the response. Now, so that's kind of my academic response. Let me give you my personal response. I am an Anabaptist, and I have a commitment to nonviolent transformation. While I don't require every brother or sister in Christ to agree with Anabaptist commitment to nonviolence, what I would say is, I would invite everybody to give nonviolence a chance. Good churches be the example of nonviolent resistance, showing that we can be committed to justice and peace through nonviolence. That is an invitation. I know it's a dangerous invitation in some contexts, but it seems to me that we Christians around the world jump too quickly to justify the use of violence when we are afraid.
Yeah, I'm going to come in so Marina can ask her question and David. So go ahead, Marina.
Would you like to answer?
I think you were next. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm next, but I'm just going to answer a very simple question. I can sort of get what you're going to say, but then I just want everyone else to hear, because at the end you said that you would like to have a women president, but not just any women. So I just want to hear a little bit more on that.
Thank you. And then maybe we could ask Israel what she thinks. Yes, and Roberto, of course.
Exactly.
We are three Peruvians in the session. Yes, you may not be aware, which is fine, but last year there was a president elected, President Castillo, from this is a weird combination, but we're talking about a man who is very conservative on social issues and very left in terms of economic policy. So he was elected, he and his vice president, Mrs. Woodward. Not a competent president, in my opinion, made many mistakes, but also the opposition, happens to be the Fujimori, led by the Fujimori family, made it impossible for him to govern. And his own incompetency made it impossible for him to govern. Eventually, he decided to close Congress by the reason of they're not letting me govern. Congress impeached him, deposed him, and Mrs. Woodward became the new president. The first announcement she made was that she was calling for elections in the shortest possible time. The next day, we heard that the shortest possible time would be like 2 years. So people in Peru responded with complete rejection of this woman. They wanted not so much the previous president to come back to power, but they wanted elections, and they still want. I mean, this weekend, there will be protests in Lima one more time to demand free and fair elections and get rid of this woman. To tell you the truth, I smiled when I heard that a woman had become the new president of Peru. Not the way I wanted. I would love for a competent woman to win the election in free and fair elections, of course. And not in this way, but I smiled and I thought, well, maybe, just maybe we get somebody minimally competent. But because of so much resistance, and of course, she's allied now with the forces of the Fujimori flank, right? I mean, imagine, it's not the British system. So you probably are more familiar with the American system. So let me give you the example. President Biden, Vice President Harris, right? She is a woman. So imagine Congress is finally able to impeach President Biden, and Kamala Harris first says, no way, I will not be part of this. Overnight, she says, I am your new president. And now she implements the policies of the opposition party rather than the policies for which she was elected with Biden. That's exactly what happened in Peru. One day, the vice president was defending the president. Overnight, she was the new president, and now she's implementing a completely different agenda than the one for her ticket that she was elected. But that's not the worst part. Because so many people got enraged, they were protesting, many of them peacefully, yes, always when there is massive protests, the likelihood of someone being violent groups, so disenfranchised people. Yes, there was violence, but not everybody was violent. The repression that she sent against protesters was so brutal. I think we are counting 70 people dead now since she became president. So I am not satisfied with having a woman president when she is just that way abusing power.
Yes, but then I would like to just add to that, but then it could have been a man as well.
Yeah.
So a quality of a man. So
Exactly, it's a quality of
yeah,
person.
so but what I was expecting you to say was that she was just getting elected, or not somebody just elected just
Not
because
even
they are a
elected.
woman. Just a nominal election or getting into power through a reserve quota or something. But then I would say now you're talking about a woman could also be as brutal as a man, and
Yes.
make no difference.
Sadly, in so many women working in very male-oriented systems come to power, and then they act as men because they had to do it to get to where they are. So yes, you're absolutely correct. It's many layers and it's very difficult for women, but we have to keep trying.
Let's go over to David. You were
Thank you very much. You talked about evangelicals expressing their dissent, perhaps because they're being manipulated or they're persuaded. What sort of model or models of dissent they be following? Obviously, they're drawing on the Bible, role models in the Bible. So were there models also from outside the Bible? So were they pre-colonial? I think part of that question has already been asked. I mean, or a mixture of pre-colonial models of descent. But that's the story of the evangelicals. What about the majority Catholics? Because Peru, as I understand it,
60%,
60,
65% Catholic.
75% Catholic. Are they by default aligned to the state, supporting the prevailing politics, who is in power, is supported by the Catholic? Or will they also express dissent in exactly the same way as evangelicals?
Thank you. Let me start responding by the end. So Catholics are way more diverse because they are historically, like, I was born Catholic because I was a human being, right? So being Catholic is just because you're born in, you happen to be born in Latin America, by default, you probably would be. That is less and less true for my children's age, right? But for when we didn't know many born, evangelicals from the cradle. You become an evangelical, you convert. With Catholics, it's not like that. So they are much more diverse, much more secular. And so I would say probably the arguments that the Bible says so is not as powerful for them that it is for. So this is basically how, so it doesn't matter really what the Bible says. If you point at one particular verse that says, for example, that homosexuality is a sin, an atrocity, whatever the language of the particular translation that you have, it's like people forget everything that is taught from the very first Genesis 1:1 to Revelations 21, the last verse. Like the whole message of the Bible is eliminated just because that verse says that homosexuality is terrible. And therefore, it's like you are allowed to hate because of that verse and forget everything taught in the Bible. And we haven't even discussed prosperity gospel, which is the actual religion growing in Latin America, by the way. And then the other mention that I wanted to make is now there is an interesting parallel between most evangelicals, because most evangelicals happen to be very conservative people, with the most conservative extreme of Catholics. So before, when I was growing up, higher education was questioned. The virtue of higher education was questioned. The virtue of learning about politics or being involved in politics was questioned. And doing anything with Catholic people, that was like dangerous territory. You are friends with the world. Today, the same people or the new generation in the same political realm are best friends with conservative Catholics who have the same single issue positions, right? So it's actually more ideologically driven than, and I am not saying this like, I really appreciate doing things with people who are Catholic and even people of other things, right? We can pursue caring for the world and the planet together. We don't need to convert everybody to do it. We can do things together. So I like that, but my concern is that it's more the excuse to not do things with people of the world so that you don't think different. And that is the manipulation, right? It's forbidden to think outside of whatever your church is telling. Instead of, church should be a place where we dialogue, where different voices are heard, different positions may be held, but we are united in the love of Christ. In the day that we go to vote, may the Lord bless you with voting one side, may the Lord bless you voting, and I am going to vote the way I think I should vote, rather than the pastor telling me from the pulpit, don't you dare to side with the communists or the socialists or the liberals or the far right or whatever. But not only that from the pulpit, but also helping people realize that voting is a responsibility, and that to vote responsibly, we need to be well.
I'll make one more comment. There's another thing that you said, where I disagree is with this Oxford statement on politics. Because it says activities involved in getting, using, power in public life and then being able to influence decisions, affect the country or society. You're Mennonite. I mean, I've always seen Mennonite polity as a politics that doesn't necessarily follow the.
Oh, very separate.
They're very separate, and I think, the people I've read and worked with and what you've been expressing is a very different definition, which is how can we go about a politics that is informed by Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and that's a very different thing. And I think we're tempted with that. I think that, that's a great temptation that just seems to me that. I think of, for all its imperfections, but it's a very good book. It's The Politics of Jesus of Yoder. And
Yes,
yeah,
more imperfect the author than the book. The book is great.
yeah, the book is great. And this is what Stanley, how else is
Yes.
that? But I think there's something in that, and I think it's just such a thing to offer the world that politics isn't because if it's all about seizing power, then what these people are doing is right. Okay, that's work. If I can use trigger politics and everything to seize power, if I can get polarization so I can seize power, then they've fulfilled this definition, I think. Whereas I think what you've been describing, which I think is so helpful, is the sense of, how can we gather and work with each other in a way that listens to each other and even builds consensuses across things. I know it's a really difficult thing when decisions have to be made, that kind of thing, but I think the Mennonite framework is one of the richest in
Yes.
in human tradition to point out. And I mentioned Havel too. That's what Havel
Yes.
pointed out when he went back to the Moravian brethren. That's what he saw. This living in truth was a way of not trying to seize power. Yeah, and just as a different way of being.
Yes,
So,
thank you. No, my argument is quite different.
yeah.
It's quite different.
So we
from
can
the
tell the
traditional
Oxford learners
Mennonites.
to go back and do some further learning.
Yes. No, actually, I am going to stick with this one, adding. Yeah, no, to me, this is actually a very useful definition for my purposes. So you have described the traditional Mennonite disengaged from politics in the outside world and creating their own
And new
polity.
politics.
Yes, and in the other extreme, we have these people who are desperate from establishing their own theocracy and defining social and economic policy in the way they think the Bible teaches. What I am actually trying to communicate is that we really need a different approach. Because whether we want it or not, we are citizens. Like right now, I am telling all my Mennonite friends, brothers and sisters, you make sure to go and vote in November this year. You cannot be a good Christian if you don't vote. I am not telling you, I will kill you if you vote for Trump. No. What I am trying to say is you vote. How you vote, for whom you vote, that's your business with God. It's not my business to tell you who to vote for, but to make sure that you vote. So that's one thing. But the other is that sadly, and I say this with love and appreciation for people in my tradition, is that we run the risk of being isolationists, and I think that misses the point. In countries where injustice prevails, in countries where women experience violence on a daily basis, where children, people with disabilities, Afro-descendants, indigenous communities experience injustice on a daily basis, we cannot be happy Mennonites singing and praying and treating each other well if we are not engaged in what happens around the country and how political power is used, which is different from trying to actually capture power through our political parties. That's really my thank you.
And on that note, we're going to tie a ribbon on this. Thank you so much. Let's Just keep this conversation going because it's so important in terms of what openness is about too, and this is a really important aspect. So again, thank you so much. And without real bit ado, and that has actually just one announcement. This is the last lecture of the MBLs until we start up again in September. So take a pause and refresh and reflect upon the great talks that we've had, and we look forward to a whole new season. Good talk. What a unique not opus. The end crowns. It is so lovely. So good. Great.
Nina, let's keep in touch. I send you my email and my WhatsApp. I just send it in the chat.